Your latest news update from Western Mass News.
I'm Matt Satillian. Here's your latest news update from Western Mass News. One person is in the hospital after a house fire early this morning in Springfield. We're told the fire broke out at an apartment complex on Cannon Circle just after 4 a.m. 6 people and 1 dog were inside when the fire started. One of those people jumped out of a second-floor window in an attempt to escape. They are now hospitalized. The cause of the fire is under investigation. The House Ways and Means Committee released 6 years of former President Donald Trump's tax returns to the public today. The committee received the returns a few weeks ago and voted to release them last week after a long battle with the Supreme Court. Trump was the first president in decades to not voluntarily release his returns to the public, fighting for years to keep them secret. The former president has called the release a, quote, outrageous abuse of power and unconstitutional. New Year's Eve is tomorrow night, and local police departments are reminding everyone to make a plan to get home safely. Departments we spoke to today say they are stepping up patrols. Springfield police say more officers will be patrolling the downtown area in hopes of keeping everyone safe during the festivities. Police advise anyone heading out to a party tomorrow night to be sure to have a designated driver or plans to call a sober ride home.
A record-breaking warm day here across Western Mass. Temperatures climbing into the low 60s in Springfield, which broke the old record of 59 set back in 1948. So it's some impressive warmth. We're not the only ones. Boston, Providence, Hartford, Albany, many breaking and tying records today. Now, this is all out ahead of a cold front, and thanks to the Bermuda high sitting off the coast, pumping in this warm, moist air out of the south and west. It will continue over the weekend, especially Saturday. We'll be back to the low to mid 50s, feeling a bit muggy. Showers approach with a cold front and low pressure system. And it looks like most of the steady rain will be Saturday evening and night. Showers will taper off likely around or before sunrise Sunday morning, and then high pressure will start building in with some slightly cooler air, and we'll have gusty breezes coming down out of the northwest. Mostly to partly cloudy tonight. I think we'll start off partly cloudy and then some patchy fog develops. Overnight lows in the mid-30s. That's balmy for this time of year. And then some early fog and clouds on Saturday. Showers arriving in the afternoon with that steadier rain for Saturday night. Highs back into the low to mid-50s. As we bring in the new year, it will be balmy. Temperatures look to actually be closer to 50 now at midnight, and we'll have some rain likely falling. Now for Sunday, again, it is going to be kind of blustery with wind gusts up to 25 miles an hour. We're dry on Monday, and showers are back later Tuesday.
Stay with Western Mass News on air, online, and on our app throughout the day for breaking news, weather, and exclusive content.